Could use a little bit.
Yeah, that's.
You will pay us to join.
Somebody gonna give you the.
So I.
Okay. Should I stand, Kathy, or can I just do it from here?
Can you get? Sure.
Okay. Okay. Ooh. I'm gonna stand because, okay. That's the speaker. I'm gonna come this way then, maybe, because it's. I just want to welcome you all to this event. I want to welcome John and Fenella back to Singapore. They really are their guest of honor today. My name's Anthony Madrano. I teach in the Department of History at NUS. I'm really excited to be part of this event. It's about birds, but it's also about so much more. It's about the people behind birds. And I think it's really, really lovely. It's great to see you all here. We've got a number of people online too, so that's also very exciting. Just to kind of introduce the event really quick, we're here for Birding in Wartime, documenting avian fauna in Singapore's Changi Prison. And before I go on any further, I'm going to pass the mic, the virtual mic, to Herman from the library. Herman?
Hi, everybody, online and on site, of course. So, good afternoon. Welcome to our event for this afternoon. So basically, I'm Herman. I'm head of archives and digital preservation in NUS Libraries. So on behalf of NUS Libraries, we actually want to thank our partners to have made this very, very possible. So one of them, of course, Dr. Madrano from the Department of History, Dr. Tan Swee Heng and his gang from the Legal Chair Natural History Museum, our panelists, so without which none of this could have happened. Okay, so what happened was 2 days ago, the guest from Fenella came down to the library, passed us a manuscript and some photographs for us to digitize. So we were very happy to be able to quickly digitize them yesterday, and it has been completed. So we would also like to take this occasion to actually do a presentation on the return of the manuscript and photographs to Fenella. So doing this will be our Vice University Librarian, Dr. Magdalene Ng. And can we have Fenella? Thank you. Me for photography.
Sorry, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, so for okay, so we would like to invite Dr. McCartney and Dr. Tan up for taking question. In front of the thank you.
Here.
Thank you, everyone.
This is really a small token from managed to capture some moments and experiences. Yeah,
Thank you so much. Thank you. So now that the formalities has been done, then let's get to the juicy parts of the event. So panel discussion. So I'll pass back the virtual mic to Madrano.
Okay. Thanks so much, Herman. And thanks again to the library for hosting this, for being such an important partner, as well as the Natural History Museum. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. And this is, for those at home, this is our panel right here. So I'll introduce the panelists, and then I think we're going to get into some sharing. The first person I want to introduce is our guest of honor, who is Fenella Madoc-Davis. Fenella is a retired teacher who was brought up in Malaysia and often accompanied her father, Guy Madoc, on jungle treks to observe and record birds. From these early expeditions, she developed a fascination for birds, as I think many of us also have a fascination for birds. She continues to be passionate about birds She's a member of the British Trust of Ornithology and has been a surveyor for their breeding bird survey in the north of England and in the southwest where she now lives. She's delighted to be in Singapore to share the story of her father and his unique bird book. And I would even add unthinkable book. When we hear the stories, the fact that, I mean, the risk involved in making a bird book, it's truly, truly remarkable and worth, if anybody's listening, it's certainly worth a Netflix miniseries. We'll get to that.
To you.
Okay. I'm also going to introduce while I'm here, I think the panel, right? Yes, right. So going on to our other one of our speakers, it'll be Dr. Tan Yen Yi. Dr. Tan is a research fellow and curator of birds at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. As an ornithologist at heart and an evolutionary geneticist by practice, Dr. Tan's research interests lie in studying the genetics of birds as well as documenting Singapore's avian fauna from a natural history perspective. So welcome to you, Yen Yi. We also have with us, beside Yen Yi, Kaitan Sin. Kaitan is president and chair of the Records Committee, which is of the Bird Society of Singapore. Keita leads the Bird Society of Singapore, an NGO that focuses on conducting research, outreach, and conservation efforts surrounding the avian fauna of Singapore and the region. As part of his Bird SOC SG work, he chairs the Records Committee that maintains the Singapore Bird Checklist and strives to document and archive crucial avian records from Singapore. So welcome to you too, Keita. And then our moderator for today, for the panel discussion that we'll have, is Miss Kathy Poe. Kathy is an oral historian and an executive at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. Kathy's a historian with a background in art and environmental history. Her research interests lie on scientific knowledge production and have lived experiences in people and societies. In her role at the museum, she leads an institutional oral history project and also conducts research on Singapore's past biodiversity through materials such as illustrations and written narratives. And I'll add, before passing, I think, this virtual mic over to Yen Yi, that Kathy has been real instrumental in putting this together on behalf of the museum. And so again, thank you, Kathy, for all your work and effort. Before we pass it over to Kate, I just want to jump in really quick and say, you might be wondering, does Fenella's father, Guy Madoc, have any birds in the museum? And the answer is?
Yes, we do. We have about 45 specimens from Madoc back then, but many more would have been lost through the passage of time, and some of them may have been given away or traded away and untraceable. But we're happy to say that we have some important ones
Collected by
Yeah,
your dad.
and even the ones that were named after Madoc are still with us. So that's something that's
Fabulous. Okay, now we can go to you, Keita. Thanks, Yen Yi.
Hi everyone, I'm Keita. First of all, thank you so much to the library for hosting this event and for inviting me to this panel. I'm very excited to be here. So for my day job, I work in the NUS Avian Lab. And then for my unpaid separate job, I lead the Bird Society of Singapore. So for a little bit of context about many of you here who might not have heard of us before, the work we do is centered around birds. We're a group of about 30 people. We work on outreach events, research stuff, and also conservation events that are related to birds in Singapore. So as part of the work we do, I lead the Bird Society of Singapore's Singapore Birds Records Committee. And the work that we do involves around, number one, curating the Singapore bird checklist. So what birds can be found here, when were they found here and stuff. And the second main thing that we do is curating this Singapore bird database. So a lot of birds are found every day in Singapore. Photographers all over the place, photographing a lot of common stuff and a bunch of rare stuff that are occasionally found. Many of these species are reported on social media sites, Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, and so on. And sometimes on other citizen science platforms like eBird, iNaturalist, that many of you might be familiar with. But a lot of these records are not properly curated. There isn't a database that really collates all these records, especially things that go on Facebook and are not on the citizen science databases. They might get lost through time. So a lot of the work that we do is by checking all these records, putting in a database, getting people to submit their records, and then voting on whether these records are valid or not. By doing this, we have a proper database of all the rare birds that have ever been found in Singapore. So many of the records today are shared through social media. There are photographs, there are nice audio recordings and stuff, top-notch recordings, records. But that's not really the case for many older records. In fact, I think just 20 years ago, records would have been mostly by text. Someone has seen it, hopefully written a good documentation about it. And even older ones, they are by specimens that INI curates. But a lot of these records, even though they might be in specimens, many information are not necessarily kept in the specimen itself only. And in order to know more about how these specimens came about and stuff, we need to read how it came about. So much of the work that we do also involves records keeping through textual accounts. When we created the database during its early days, we read through a lot of papers from 1879, 1923 by Jason and so on. And of course, an introduction to Malayan Birds by Guy. So first of all, oh my God, this book, it's amazing. So Anthony has shared a little bit about the stories, and I think we can talk more about it later on. But this whole book was written while he was in prison, based on documentations that he had from his own birdwatching experiences before he went to prison. Now, if you throw me in prison today, I'm not going to be able to write a book like that. I won't be able to recall, detailed information about birds just at the snap of my fingers. But when you read this book, there are details about things like when these birds nest, how big their eggs are, such detailed information all written while he was in prison. It's amazing. And also the fact that, he had to get, I think, a friend of his to write it on the typewriter, and he had to keep that guy's anonymous so that people won't swarm towards him. It's quite interesting, I think, the fact that this whole book was written secretly while he was in prison. So I think when this book was first released, it was meant to be sort of like a field guide for people. When you're out there, you can use this book to identify birds and stuff. But when we look at the book today, from today's perspective, from 2025's perspective, it's a little bit different. The book is not just a field guide, but it is a piece of documentation that tells us a lot about what the situation was here back then in 1920. 48, sorry. 43, my bad memory. So I just want to share a few interesting bits about this book that really struck out to me as special. So the first one is this. Those of you who are familiar with the birds in Singapore might know that this is the mangrove pitta. But in the book, number one, this book is described as, the common name is written as larger blue-winged pitta. So this already first tells us a lot of things that have changed since then. Many common names of birds have changed over the times. Back in the days, because of how similar this bird looks like to the blue-winged pitta, they just called it the larger blue-winged pitta, although it's not actually bigger, but it's slightly more robust. And the second thing about it is that it is reported that this bird was breeding in Singapore. Now, if you look around Singapore today, you won't be able to find breeding mangrove pittas on Singapore Island. You might be able to find them at Pulau Ubin and Pulau Tekong, but they used to be here. So this already tells us this information that has changed since 1944. And today, the mangrove pitta used to be present, but it is activated. Now, there are many other contexts that we can get from this book. So these are two introduced birds that you can find in Singapore today, the sulphur-crested cockatoo and the sooty-headed bulbul. Again, if you look at this book, it describes how these two species are already found as introduced species in Singapore. And it gives us a lot of context again, because when we look at the birds in Singapore today, it's impossible to tell the history of its species just by looking at them. But when we look at all these old text accounts, we can realize that this cockatoo has been in Singapore for over 80 years introduced. Same for the sooty-headed bulbul. And all these are information that can only really be captured if you have proper text accounts. So I'm going to wrap my talk up. It's going to be quite short. But the point that I'm really trying to get across today is about history. Now, when we have specimens, when we have things like bird records that are in databases, all these quantitative information that we can get tells us a lot of stories that can be used for analysis and stuff. But there are a lot of qualitative information that will be lost, even if you have, say, a checklist of 50 Java minor, 20 black-naped orioles, stuff. It is very important that we are aware of the situation that we are in today, and we make sure we document these things properly, so that in the future, 50 years later, when someone goes out to, say, botanical gardens and sees 200 black-naped orioles. They might think that is normal, but that's actually not the case. Today, you might only see, let's say, 20 if you go out one day. So all this information needs to be properly documented. And the work that the library is doing, the museum is doing, it's excellent. I'm really thankful for all these documentations that's being carried out. And this act of creating history is something that all of us can do. The younger ones among the audiences, when you go out bird watching or looking for herbs and stuff, if you find a particularly interesting documentation, let's say 3 king cobras fighting, things like that, seemingly trivial information like that might not seem to require documentation, but they could actually tell a story when many people have such information together, and we analyze it in the future. Let's say, I think a couple of years ago, I had this particular event where I saw, I think, 8 coppersmith barbets perched on one tree. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know why they were doing that, and I couldn't really find much information on why that was happening. I think 2 years later, I saw someone else posting a photo on Facebook, again, of about 10 or 12 coppersmith barbets perching together. Now, until today, I still have no idea what the whole event was about. These sort of documentation, if more people write them down and post them in places like Nature in Singapore and Lei Kong Chen, or even our blog, maybe in the future, one day someone will be able to figure out what's going on. So telling these stories are extremely important. And the day that we live in today, in the future, is going to be taught as history. But if we don't properly document it, all this information will be lost. And which is why I think today's event of documenting this excellent book over here it's a really, really historical event. And as we live our days, I hope that everyone here can also continue to create history. Tell your stories, and for those of you who still have the opportunity, ask your parents about stories, ask your grandparents about stories. Oral history, which is a project that Katie has been working on, is also extremely important. And all these things that we do can really make sure that information is kept for the future generations. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Keita. We're now going to go to Fenella to share a bit about your dad, your story, the book, and all that you've got to share with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about my father, Guy Madoc, and to be able to tell you about his ornithology and his authorship of an introduction to Malayan birds, which, as I think you've already gathered, was written under the most amazing circumstances. I'm going to take it in different chunks. So we start off with his childhood. He grew up on the Isle of Man, which is a small island between Ireland and England. To give you a comparison, it's just a little smaller than Singapore. There the comparison stops. It has a population of 84,000 today. I think yours is nearly 6 million. When my father was growing up in the 1920s and 30s, the population was about 30,000. And man had touched the island very little. It's an island with an immense variety of landscape. It has a chain of mountains running through it, a very rugged coastline, and it was paradise for a boy who wanted to study birds. How did he get into bird watching? Well, his father was also an eminent amateur ornithologist, he too had written a book, The Birds of the Isle of Man. So when my father came out to Malaya to work in January 1931, age 20, he was already really fascinated with bird life and very excited about discovering tropical birds. He would go on expeditions deep into the Malayan jungle, which in the 1930s was far more extensive and wilder than it is today. Very early on, he became friends with a Malay man called Majid. This is Majid standing beside a bird hide. Majid was an ingenious man who knew how to create things from jungle materials. So this very primitive looking structure, which my daughter told me looked like a latrine, is actually a bird hide. And it's made from jungle bamboos, poles, around which is wrapped hessian, and there's a hole through which to study the birds. And my father would spend hours at somewhere where he believed there was a nest site. and watched the bird over a period of time. He always made notes about what he saw. At that time, cameras were very expensive and rare and out of the question. But after the war, when camera equipment became cheaper, he was able to get his own camera and he started taking photographs. Now, these photographs were of a high quality in the 50s, and I'm delighted that the museum has digitized some of his original photographs because, as Kita was saying, it gives you an indication of what was common then and what is maybe not common now. This is my father going on a jungle expedition. I want you to look at the equipment he's got. I don't know if you can all see the jungle knife, the parang strapped to his waist. Around his neck, he has binoculars, a backpack, and a sturdy stick made from a jungle sapling. Here he's on the island of Pulau Pera in the Malacca Strait. This was a favorite place for him to go to study birds, and the bird is the brown booby. In this photograph, my father is with a group of Malay fishermen. The man, two to his left is Majid, and they're on the coast of Terengganu, on the northeast side of Malaya. Now, while my father was posted to Alor Star on the Thai border, he was studying the blue rock thrush, and he noticed differences, subtle differences in the Malayan species. And he submitted his evidence to the Raffles Museum, which, as you've learned, was the forerunner to this museum, including a bird which he shot for scientific verification. This actual bird is in the museum today. After the war, and after extensive peer review, it was established as a separate species of bird and given the scientific name Monticola solitarius madoci. My father was very proud to have a bird named after him. This photograph shows a male, and this was taken by another ornithologist who lives in Ipoh in Malaya. This is the period when my father actually wrote the book. In December 1941, the Japanese invaded Malaya. My father, mother, and brother were living in Alor Star, close to the Thai border. In the following weeks, they were forced to move from place to place down the Malay Peninsula as the British Army retreated. And eventually they reached Singapore. My mother and brother escaped by ship just before the island capitulated. My father had to remain in post, and he was taken prisoner along with about 50,000 civilian and military personnel. Most of the civilian internees, of which my father was one, were housed in Changi Jail, which had been built in the 1930s for civilian prisoners. It was built for 600 people, and there were many thousands in it. The overcrowding was terrible, the food was very scarce, and before long, disease became rife. So I've tried to give you a little bit of an idea of what this was like. It wasn't like prison today. There was always the threat of torture by the Japanese, which in some cases led to death. But in these terrible circumstances, my father set to write a book about birds. Kita has already referred to this. His information was only from memory because he had not carried anything into prison with him. But over a period of about 15 months, he came up with this amazing record. And it's amazing not necessarily because of what it tells you about birds, but you have to think about the circumstances in which it was written. If you look closely at this picture, see this is the black-necked tailor bill, beautifully made photo picture. It's a watercolor. And it was done not by my father, but by a fellow prisoner called David Molesworth. It's worth considering how on earth he would have had those materials with him. I mean, who's going to go into a Japanese prisoner of war camp carrying a paint box and brushes? So I can only conclude, because my father never told me about this, I can only conclude that the groups of prisoners were often sent back into Singapore City to clear up the mess that the Japanese had made by bombing. And every time they went, excuse me, every time they went back in, they were asked if they could get something by fellow prisoners. Now, usually it was practical things like food, that was the main concern, or perhaps razor blades or a toothbrush. But David Molesworth asked if someone could find him some paint materials. And with whatever it was he was given, he painted a beautiful picture like this. This is the black and red broadbill, which I think you mentioned, didn't you? Black and red broadbill with a nest. And this is the finished product of the book, which is this. Now, you'll notice it's covered in what appears to be red leather. Once again, you might ask, how on earth do you get hold of leather in a Japanese prisoner of war camp? My father told me that this was leather from the upholstery of a car wrecked in Singapore City. So once again, somebody who had been sent in there to clear up bomb damage would have been asked if they could find something. So when the book was finished, which as I say took about 15 months, somebody needed to put it together. It needed to be held together somehow. And there were 2 French prisoners of war who were bookbinders by profession. And with the leather, they managed to cover it. And it's just astonishing. This is 81 years old, and yet it's still, well, it's still handleable. And now, thanks to the museum, it's digitized. My father took this little item into prison with him. This is a very small, well, tiny, folding telescope. You're very welcome to have a look at this later on. You can see how small it is. I've put beside it for comparison a British 50p piece. But it's actually 50, isn't it? Oh, 20, okay. But what's more significant is that this is the sort of thing the Japanese were very suspicious of, because they assumed that this would be used to study what was happening outside the prison. So he had to keep this concealed. If he was caught with it, he wouldn't just be asked, what are you doing with this? He would probably be tortured. So he took an enormous risk bringing this into prison with him. This finished book passed through many hands in the prison because books were scarce, people were book hungry. Not only that, but this book gave them a connection with the outside world. Even if they couldn't see many birds, which they wouldn't have been able to, inside this grim prison camp, by reading it, they could learn or be reminded of something that was going on outside the grim prison walls. But as time went by, the Japanese regime in Changi became harsher and harsher. Initially, it had been possible for people to meet in groups and societies. I don't know if any of you know, but there was actually the Changi Bird Observation Group. And they were incredibly helpful to my father because they shared their remembrance, their knowledge of birds they had learned about. But after about 15 months, there was a particular incident called the Double 10th. It was October 1943, when the prisoners were all herded out of their huts and their cells and made to stand all day in the sun while the huts were searched. What the Japanese were looking for were radio transmitters, because there had been an incident in Singapore Harbour where a very daring group of Australian and British soldiers had come over in an Australian fishing boat, and they came ashore, they came into the harbour in folding canoes, what were known as foal boats, and attached limpet mines to the hulls of various Japanese ships, and were blown up. They were blown up. This group escaped and got back to Australia. But the Japanese were, well, it was a huge blow to their pride, the fact that somebody had penetrated their defenses and managed to damage their shipping. And they assumed that the information for this had come from the prisoners of war in Changi. So they searched the place. Anybody who they thought might have been involved in it was taken away and tortured. And there were absolutely terrible tales of how people were treated. And as a result of that, as I said, conditions became very harsh. All these clubs and societies were closed down. And having a bird book that had been created in the prison was a very risky thing to do. But my father managed to keep it all through internment. I don't know how he did it, because these searches of their huts were frequent, but he held on to it and he took it back to England with him, and he was repatriated in September 1945. He took it back to his parents' house on the Isle of Man, proudly presented it to his mother, who opened it and said, "Take it away, Guy, it's full of bed bugs." So Malaya post-war, my father was given 6 months to recover from his privation in Changi, and he went back to Malaya in 1946, May 1946, and he continued studying birds. He kept these meticulous records, which were stored in this museum for quite some while. And these are some of the people he was with. This is again on Pulau Pera, the rocky island in the Straits of Malacca. My father is on the left, and between them is Majid, the man who was so important to him. And on his right is David Molesworth, who was the man who did the illustrations in Changi Prison, who did the 2 beautiful watercolors. My father introduced me to bird watching when I was about 8. And here we are on a disused road, slightly overgrown road in Fraser's Hill, looking for birds' nests. I showed you his very early telescope. Finally, he managed to get a more up-to-date telescope. And here he is at Fraser's Hill studying birds. The bird book that was produced in Changi is the one on the left with the leather cover, this actual bird book here. After the war, in about 1947, it was published by the Malayan Nature Society in softback. It had hardly been altered at all since this original one. So this is, as we go left to right, this is the second one along. And Keith has actually shown us an illustration of that, but it was by no means comprehensive. It was just in softback. It had no photographs. So in 1956, my father further edited and added to the book that's in the middle, the one with the hornbill on, which came out initially as a hardback. It had photographs in it, only one color photograph, because it was still very expensive to produce photographs in books, quite a number of black and white photographs, a lot of which were taken by my father, also by David Molesworth, who you've seen a picture of, and 1 or 2 other European ornithologists. A few years later, it was published in softback, that's the blue book, and then it was translated into Malay, which is the final book there. So that's the array of the editions of the book. It's fascinating that the one in the middle, you can still buy. You can get that secondhand. And then the piece at the bottom is a tribute to my father, which was put in the Malayan Nature Society's journal in 2011. It was 100 years since his birth. This is my father and I just a few years before his death. This is at his home in the Isle of Man. And then in 2014, I came out to this museum. The museum was being built, as probably a number of you will know, but Sui He had been in contact with me for several months because they said they wanted to do a permanent exhibition about my father. So here I am with the original book, and also with this sample that my father had sent in 1940 of the blue rock thrush. I find it amazing that's the actual bird. Sui He went to a huge amount of trouble over this display. I'm very grateful to him, but he still pesters me about what sort of typewriter it was, as if I could know. He even tells me that he's analyzed the typeface and that there are 2 typewriters in use. No one has any idea where the second one was. And that's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Fenella, for your sharing. And thank you, Yenny and Keita, for sharing about Birdsong and museum's work as well. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I think, so for me as a oral historian at the museum, I first met Fenella 2 years ago when I traveled to Devon to meet her, to find out more about her father's work and to see the book in person as well. And at the time, Fenella and John were really wonderful hosts to me. So I'm really happy that we've been able to bring you here on this trip as well. And I think when I saw the book for the first time when I was visiting Fenella, I think what really struck me the most was also, I think, the circumstances that it was created in, and what the video mentioned, and that I think I would like to emphasize again was the fact that this book was actually circulated among prisoners, and it was read by so many people who were in Changi intern at the time as well. And I think to think about the history of the book, the way it was created, the hands it has been passed through, it's very incredible, I think. And I think today, by bringing Yenny and Keita on board to open up the conversation, I think it's very exciting for me, because I think this allows us to really see the significance of your father's book, because it's not just historical artifact. I mean, it's very important in that regard, but also for Fenella, it's really a family heirloom. It's something that is so personal to you as well. But also at the same time, for us working at the museum, for ornithologists, it's something that is also such an important resource that really gives a historical perspective that we really wouldn't be able to get back and retrieve if it wasn't already recorded in that time. And I was thinking that for the panel discussion, since we have the actual book here with us, perhaps could we take a look at it, Fenella?
Of course. Earlier, I found Anthony pouring through it. And I
Without
said,
gloves,
I
without
hope you're going to
gloves.
be wearing white gloves. But no, it is a very precious thing, but everybody is very welcome to look at it. And also this tiny telescope, which is apart from the book, it's the only artifact I have of my father's time in prison. It's a period he never talked about. So it's really since his death that I've had the opportunity through various medium to piece together his story.
And actually, I was wondering if you could tell us more about how that process was like, piecing together your father's story, or even how you obtained that monocular. Because
Well, the monocular, I believe, belonged to my grandfather, the man who on the Isle of Man had written a book about Malayan Manx birds of the Isle of Man. He, I think, gave it to my father when my father came to Malaya in 1931. And it's a very strange way it came to me. It was a mutual friend of mine and my father who had been lent this little telescope. It seems like on long-term loan. And I think my father had forgotten about it, because when he died, nobody had said anything about this telescope. And the friend, Liz, gave it to me after his death and said, I think you need to have this back. And I said, well, I don't know anything about it. Do you know anything about it? And she said, yes, it belonged to your grandfather. He gave it to my father, to Guy. Guy lent it for many, many years to Majid, the Malay man who was so pivotal in his birding expeditions. And then after Majid's death, my father gave it to this lady, Liz, and she kept it until, as I say, after my father died, she passed it to me. In terms of learning more about the writing of the book in Changi, I always knew vaguely. You must remember that I was only a child in Malaya at the time. So as a child, you don't really pay very much attention to what your parents are doing. But I do know that every morning I used to come down and my father would be tapping away on a typewriter, working on that third edition of the book, which is the one you can still find online. But again, I wasn't particularly interested. And then it turned out that this was the precursor. And again, you don't really listen as a child when people are telling you where, how it had been written. Added to which, as I said, my father was very, very reluctant to talk about his period as a prisoner of war. It was too painful. But in the early, excuse me, in the early 1980s, there was a British radio series called Tales from the South China Seas. And my father was interviewed extensively by a producer from the BBC. And his conversations with this man were recorded on tape cassette. And my father, after his death, I found these tapes and I learned a lot more about the circumstances of being taken a prisoner of war through those. And I suppose when I was asked by the museum to come up with some information so they could do this display, I ferreted around in my parents' photographs and found more material. So I've really only learned very much about the first edition of this book in the last 20, 30 years.
Okay, and I think because Fenella, you also have some photographs with you, right? Could we look at the photos as well? Because I was thinking that it would be something that everyone would be interested in seeing as well. Because some of these photographs were taken by Guy Madoc, and they were Fenella, which year were the photos taken by your father?
Which ones do you mean?
The birds.
Oh, all the bird photographs. They were taken in the 1950s. I would say probably between about 1954 and 1959 when my father left Malaya. I don't know how best we can look at these unless they can be put out on a table. But for those of you who are interested in birds, the detail on these is amazing. How would you
So
like to present this?
I think perhaps because I remember I said when Fenella was sharing about the photos with a few of us from the museums and the libraries on Monday. Sorry, I think I showed some of the photos to Keita and Yenye as well, and Keita was quite excited about which one was it?
I think it's the Noddy.
Why don't you
Noddy,
go through them?
Noddy as well, it is.
There's a much bigger picture of a noddy.
Could you share with us more about it, Keita?
That's a movie also.
Oh, the Noddy.
Or what?
That's a
looks
moth
like-
gannet. The noddy is,
This.
That one.
yeah.
Where was this photographed?
Sorry?
It's at the
Where-
back.
Where? It was taken on Pulau Para.
So
And there's another one of it.
it's a common noddy.
Brown. Yeah, I think it's known as brown noddy today. The name has changed since then.
Yeah.
But so I think personally, I've read a lot about these places, a lot of documentations from, 1900s. And these islands, they aren't really, or they might be, but even if they are visited today, there aren't a lot of documentations about the birds there from, I think, the modern, like maybe past 20, 30 years, even longer. But we know that the birds are probably still there. And a lot of these,
Just one back for
That's the. that's
okay, so for a little bit of context, this brown noddy, for the Zoom peak, a lot of these seabirds, they nest in isolated islands, usually very rocky places. These are places where there are no mammals and predators to get them. And very rarely you get to watch these birds breeding. Around Singapore, there is one particular rock near Changi where some terns nest, like nape terns. And there are nearby places for these noddies. In fact, they haven't been recorded within Singapore waters before. And so I was particularly excited when I saw this photograph because these are actual pictures taken from these tiny islands in the middle of Sumatra and Peninsula Malaysia that I probably will never ever get to visit. And it's just like, I don't really know how to describe this feeling, but it's just wow. Wow.
parasitism. So these are really very evocative photographs because they don't just show the portrait of the bird, but it's the behavior of the birds that are very hard to document because these are, for instance, this one here is of a greyback flycatcher warbler that's feeding a brood parasite called the lesser cuckoo. So cuckoos are brood parasites. That means they are very naughty birds. They don't raise their own young. They like to, in Singapore, in Singlish, like to tompang their children to other people. They like to leave their children at other nests. They lay eggs in other birds' nests and make them raise their young. It's a very successful breeding strategy, and it's not something that I bet it would have been something that you have to follow nests to really document. And this is one of the few photographs from that time, original photographs from that time that show such a behavior. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt? If Keita wants to pass this round, people can look at it in more detail because it's very difficult to see the detail. If you actually get to see the picture, you will see the discrepancy in size between this tiny host bird and this colossal chick.
So if you go online today and look for photographs of birds feeding cuckoos, you'll probably find a lot of them. Great ones, Facebook, everywhere on the internet. But to think that these pictures were taken so long ago, and these documentations are very hard to get even today because of how shy birds are when they're breeding.
Yeah.
So it just tells so much about the amount of effort that went into taking this photograph that we'll get to see in a bit.
Can I just interrupt again for a minute? You saw the hide, this very sort of basic looking structure. These pictures that we're passing around are the product of hours and hours sitting in that hide, being bitten to death by mosquitoes to get these pictures. And there's a very interesting series here, which I'd be happy to pass around. This is the chestnut-backed forktail. And you'll see the first one shows the bird landing on the nest. And that, as we go through, feeding its chick, and there's a more enlarged version of the same. And there's one more to do with the forktail. And here, I find this one fascinating. The bird is removing the fecal sac. So please pass these around in the order that they're in, and you can see how it happens exactly. Do you want to pass those around, Keita?
Did your father publish on behavior? I mean, other than the.
The only book he wrote was this book, which he hoped would be a handbook for people to take into the field. A lot of these pictures did end up in the hands of other ornithologists in the 70s and 80s. People would still contact my father and say, could I ask you information about this, that, or the other bird? And by the way, do you have any photographs you could share? So there is one of these pictures circulating, and on the back, there is a stamp which indicates that it was in the hands of an Italian ornithologist.
Maybe I'll just
Have
say
you
one.
worked out how to use it?
No.
You have to close it first. So this is the way you use it as a telescope. You look through that. You focus on there. I have to say the images are not terribly good, but it is very old. It's probably over 100 years old. And if the lenses were cleaned, you might get something.
It will.
But the main thing is it's so tiny, you could just slip it into your pocket.
It's amazing that device made its way through prison life.
Absolutely.
Because like you said, that would certainly, I mean, one would imagine based on all the TV I watch, that would be a red flag. Could you say maybe a little bit more about your father's friend, Majid?
Yes.
I mean, it seemed like they were friends before the war and after
Oh,
the
yes,
war.
absolutely. Yeah, Majid probably met my father in about 1933, and I have no idea how they came together. I mean, he was an illiterate Malay from a rural background, but there was something between them. They kept in touch, and Majid was persuaded to climb into all sorts of ghastly places because he was very agile and he had no fear of heights. My father was very fearful of heights. And actually it was Majid who managed to get the really close-up observations of the Madoc's blue rock thrush, because this bird was nesting on sheer limestone cliffs near Al-Ostar. And Majid would climb up to the nest, and there was no camera then, so no photograph, but he would come back to my father and describe what he'd seen. And then when war came to Malaya, everything was totally disrupted. My father had to escape down through the Malayan Peninsula. He lost touch with Majid, but suddenly Majid reappeared again in 1946, and they were reunited.
Wow. And Majid lived in Al-Ostar or around.
He must have lived somewhere around. I've been asked by Malayan historians to try and trace him, but the trouble is I don't even know his full name. I mean, I remember him I think I was about 6 when he died. And I remember him as a lovely man who was always prepared to do something for me. For instance, he built me the most wonderful tree house in a frangipani. And I used to go down to his quarters, which was part of the garage. And he was probably quite a poor man, but he was always happy to share some of his supper with me. Boiled rice and ikan bilis. I remember it's an absolutely wonderful meal.
Can I open up the floor to questions? I'm sure there are things that you might want to ask Fenella or the rest of the panel about. Does anyone have questions?
Hi.
I'm just intrigued what your father did after returning to the UK. Was he still involved with birding in the UK or?
A bit. He went back to live in the Isle of Man, and he was no longer doing any serious observation, because don't forget he'd been brought up there, so none of this was fresh and new to him. He certainly wasn't about to write a book about it. But I think his main task was to teach me. I mean, it wasn't a conscious task, you just absorb it. But as his eyesight failed, which it did towards the end of his life, even with binoculars, he didn't find watching birds easy at all. But, you know, it was his passion all his life.
Perhaps to build on that question, where else in the region did he visit
Did he
birds, travel to study birds? things like that?
Well, his job, which was a police officer, was moved him all around the Malay Peninsula, certainly before the war. And so that's why he saw such varied terrain and learned such a lot about birds. I didn't mention that he kept meticulous field notes, and those notes can still be accessed at the British Natural History Museum Library, which is just outside London. I donated them to the library on his death because he had requested that.
Oh, very nice. So his field notes from his Singapore, Malaya, and sort of
Never mentioned Singapore. He never lived here
Okay,
and would not come back to the island.
right.
I'm sorry, guys, but he hated Singapore for those reasons.
Sorry. His
So
Malayan
all
field.
all his observations were in Malay.
Mhm.
So he was initially started in Kuala Lumpur, where he was trained and learned Malay. His first posting was to a place in Pahang called Jelebu, which was very isolated and very rural. And that got him absolutely fascinated because there was such wonderful nature around him. And he also had to use his Malay very hard there because hardly anybody spoke English. Then he went to Kuala Selangor on the Straits of Malacca. He was sent to Kuantan on the East Coast. And as I say, he was in Alor Star just before the war broke out. But after the war, all his working life was spent in Kuala Lumpur. So that's the only place I knew as a child, apart from holidays. We always went on holidays to do something to do with birds, much to my mother's disgust.
Do you have any other questions? Okay, then I will ask one. Fenella, how did your father's interest in birds influence you growing up? And how was it like to also be birding in post-war Malaya?
First part of your question, I suppose you absorb this kind of thing. It's almost in your DNA. You know, if you've got a father who's always got binoculars around his neck and always stopping to look at things, then you start to think, well, why are we doing this? And perhaps it's interesting. But it wasn't until I was about 8 or 9 that he felt I was old enough to go with him into the jungle. Because this was tough walking. You know, there were no manicured paths. You were on literally little jungle paths about this wide. And you had to cross streams and make your way through tree roots. But I found it absolutely fascinating. And it was a unique experience for a European child. Nobody else I know who was brought up in Southeast Asia had ever an experience like that.
So let's say we were to go to Fraser's Hill today from Kuala Lumpur. It's nice roads, great drive. How was it like when you visited that?
Oh, there was a decent metalled road. The last time I was in Fraser's Hill was 2004, and I was impressed that it was still very undeveloped. I gather of the Malaysian hill stations, it's the least popular, but it is a great place for birding. I mean, they have something, do you remember what it's called, John? The bird race, I think, which I was absolutely horrified about. So I thought it meant take a captive bird up and release it and see how quickly it gets What it turns out is that over a period of a few days, people go around recording all the birds they can possibly observe. I mean, it's twitching in the extreme because I don't really think you're taking it very much in other than the fact that you've seen a new species and recorded it. But I was very pleased to know that there were still a lot of birds in Malaya, because one of the sadnesses is, and this is global, that the number of birds in terms of species is in free fall. And that's terrible.
Are there any particular species that were special to you from Fraser's Hill or anywhere else?
From Fraser's Hill, trouble is I don't remember a lot of the names now, but I do remember, the coppersmith barbet, which I think is very common still, isn't it? Its call is so evocative. Boom, 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 boom. That's why it's called the coppersmith. Yeah.
Okay, I see we have some questions from our audience tuning in. Okay, I will do the second question first. From I can't really read.
You can read that. It's good.
Pastel 3FE to everyone at 3:18 p.m.
Yes, I have noticed that most of the photographs shown are from Fraser's Hill. Is it because of any emotional attachment to the place?
I think it was because my father thought it was such a rich environment, and there are a lot of migratory species there, which I'm sure you all know. So, yeah, and also my parents liked the cool climate. This was in the days before air conditioning, so it was quite a treat to go somewhere where you had to put a sweater on.
And the other question we have is from Sarah C. to everyone at 3:15. As the museum is digitizing the book, is there any way a digital copy can be made available? So for that, the library will be
representing NUS libraries and in collaboration with our folks out there. We are pleased to share that we have actually got a copy of Fenella's dad's book on Monday, and we have digitized it. And we are actually processing it. So we'll make it available online after post-processing as soon as we can. So give us some time, it will be on Digital Gems. Thank you.
I will say just quickly then about that digitization of the book. I mean, this is a significant book within the history of ornithology in Singapore. You know, they're really up until kind of pre-war, there was only one book, 1923. Then there was the Robinson book, which just came up, I think, the next decade in the 30s. Then it's your father's book, which there was actually a pretty big break between the 30s and when books were being published in the late 40s and early 50s. Your father's book fits right in there. And then it really explodes in the 50s. I think during the subsequent editions of your father's book, Gibson Hill has a book, who is also at the museum. Lok Wan To has a book, who is a sort of fellow photographer like your father, and then onwards. So there's a very significant place in which your father's book sort of sits within that story. There weren't that many before. His was probably the only one, certainly during the wartime, and really probably for the 40s, I would say. So very important. And the fact that it's now, or going to be soon, available for students, for researchers, for various publics to access, I think that's really an amazing contribution. So thank you for carrying it. Thank you for being the caretaker of it too. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Hello.
Are there any accounts of by other internees about his effort? Because you suggested that, I mean, there was a combined effort to provide the sightings, the materials, keep the book hidden, make sure he's safe.
Yeah.
So do you know of anyone else who might have talked about it?
Well, yes, I mean, one or two collaborators who come to mind are David Molesworth, the man who was also a skilled artist. I don't believe he ever wrote and published anything, but he certainly would have talked, I guess, quite a lot to other people in the 50s. But don't forget that all these people who've been through a prisoner of war camp, the last thing they wanted to remember was that. Also, Carl Gibson Hill, who I think you referred to, you said he published a book.
Yeah.
I've never seen that book.
I think in 49 maybe, or a checklist.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So he never actually wrote a narrative, if you like.
No narrative.
Okay. So no, I don't believe so. I mean, anybody who wrote anything like notes or a journal was really risking their life in Changi. I don't think we have any idea today of, well, I suppose maybe we do, because perhaps this happens in places like North Korea or the Soviet Union or Russia. But the risk you take by doing something that's regarded as subversive is huge.
And that's, I think, just to kind of underscore that point, here we have birding as subversive,
Yes.
an active subversive. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Quite amazing.
The little video that I showed you referred to a man called Nicholas Milton, who wrote a book about the role of birds in the Second World War. He researched that quite a lot, and he discovered that, for instance, in a German prisoner of war camp, a group of prisoners got together, and there was a European bird there called the redstart, and they wrote a lot about that, which was published after the war and was an important element in ornithological research. Sweetie, do you remember meeting Miss Milton? He certainly came to this museum. That's where he got to know about my father's story.
He got in touch with me because he wanted to contact you.
That's right. Yes. That,
So I have never met.
okay, right. But these links are amazing. You know, you suddenly meet new people, make new friends, if I may call you a friend, through something like.
Okay, we have another question from online, from everyone. I wonder if your father possibly made a checklist of birds observed in Changi while he was there?
I don't believe so. I think there was very little observation, to be honest. I mean, who would want to, bird would want to fly into Changi Prison? I mean, I didn't mention, but after about 18 months, quite a number of prisoners of civilian internees, which is what technically my father was, were moved out of Changi to camp on Sime Road. I assume Sime Road is still a road in Singapore.
Yes.
And this was a much pleasanter environment in the sense that it was an open area. Prisoners had to build their own huts, again, out of jungle materials, because Sime Road then was a very, very rural part of Singapore. They were also supposed to grow their own food because the Japanese were really running out of food, not just for the prisoners of war, who they cared nothing about, but for themselves as well. So they gave the prisoners of war seeds and told them to get on with it. So in the course of cultivating this land, I'm sure they would have seen more birds because it was a much wilder environment. But by this time, I think people didn't really have the energy to be doing very much recording. The energy was spent in staying alive.
Okay, I think we'll take one last question online before we proceed to towards wrapping up.
Okay.
Okay, so the last question we have is, hi, thank you all for this insightful sharing. It is incredible that the book was written from memory. Curious about the watercolor paintings of the birds. Any idea if the inmate who had drawn them, David, did so solely from Madoc's description without any visual sightings?
Well, David Molesworth was an amateur ornithologist anyway. I mean, he was a medical doctor, but he was also an amateur ornithologist. So he would have observed these birds himself. So I'm sure he was doing it from his own memory, perhaps in collaboration with my father's memory, Carl Gibson Hill's memory, any other people who were bird watchers in Changi.
And was David a doctor in Singapore, in Malaya?
In Malaya.
He was in Malaya.
He ran the leper colony just outside Kuala Lumpur. I remember meeting him. He was a friend of mine. He and his wife were friends of my parents until David left Malaysia, probably in the late 50s, as my father did. My father retired in September 1959.
And was your father and David also members of the Malayan Nature Society?
Yes, yes, very much so.
Okay, I think we are reaching 3:30, so perhaps we can wrap up because some people might have to leave as well. So I think just on behalf of NUS, we'd like to thank Fenella and John again for coming down to Singapore all the way from the UK. It's a very long flight, and thank you for also dealing with the time difference as we've ferried you around the past 2 days. to come to the library, to go birding with
Yeah.
Yumi and Keita as well, and of course visiting the museum. And we'd also like to thank Bird Society for supporting this event. And on behalf of the museum, we would also like to thank the Department of History, Anthony, and also NUS Libraries for making this event possible. Especially Dr. Natalie Pang, Dr. Magdalene Ng, and all the NUS Library staff who have put in a lot of work organizing this, doing the digitization, and rushing the digitization to have it done in time for today's sharing, which I think is really very exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I will pass the time on to Herman from the library now to do a little closing.
We have a little bit more to share with you guys. So as mentioned, we are very honored to have this treasure in our collection. And I think it rightfully fits into our collection of biodiversity that the library already has. So I think it's a fitting place to have it within its friends, actually, in our rich biodiversity collection. So to introduce you a little bit more to our biodiversity collection in the library, I have our librarian, Mak Jia-Ying, to give you an introduction to our collection.
Okay, thank you, Herman. So before I start, I must say that I feel very inspired by the conversations just now. So let's give all our speakers a round of applause. So as we all know, okay, a precious gem will be digitized and added to our collection. Now it's time to discover more, which is why I'm here to share the biological resources that are available in NUS Libraries. Oh, by the way, I'm Jane, okay, a STEM research librarian from NUS Libraries as well. Okay, so we have this subject guide which provides an overview of selected resources available to support biological sciences research and assignments. So in this guide, we have pages that provides a list of NUS Library subscribed resources as well as freely accessible websites. The resources we refer to can be databases, books, journals, and writing guides as well. So for more information, you can scan the QR code on the right, okay, and there's a full URL below. In fact, we have many research guides as well as subject guides created by NUS librarians. If you are interested to find out more, you can access the main URL, which is libguides.nus.edu.sg. And on the other hand, we have Biodiversity Library of Southeast Asia. It contains biodiversity literature on Southeast Asia. So this includes selected titles from a rich biodiversity collection inherited from the Raffles Museum. So as mentioned by Dr. Tan earlier, okay, the Raffles Museum actually started as early as 1878. Okay, so you can imagine the materials inside to be very old and rare. Okay, and thankfully, they have since been digitized and made accessible to everyone via this digital library. Okay, so for more information, you can scan the QR code. Same thing, we have the full URL here. Okay, to those who are interested in other materials on Southeast Asia, you can access the main URL, which is digitalgems.nus.edu.sg. So other materials also include historical newspapers, which is very rare and is hard to find in other places as well. And thirdly, okay, we know there's a lot of action going on behind the scenes to make this event possible, which is why we are glad that Dr. Tan Sihi, Dr. Tan Yin, as well as Katie, okay, from the Lincolnshire Natural History Museum, they have actually documented the whole amazing journey in the form of this blog post that is now published in NUS Libraries blog. So in this blog post, they actually talked about the partnership that was forged between the museum and Fenella and then the library. So it's very nice to know that a beautiful bond was formed between Fenella and the museum as early as 2014. So cheers to the 10-year friendship. Okay, and speaking of NUS Libraries blog, okay, we also have another blog post by our beloved research librarian, Wong Kar-wai. Okay, let's say hi. Yes. Okay. So in her blog post, she talked about works of a naturalist called Alfred Wallace. Okay, so I have a question for you. Okay, so his works can be dated back to 1865. Okay, do you know what bird species was featured in his very first publication? Okay, we call it the earliest publication of birds of the Malay archipelago. Can you guess what bird species was featured in that work? The hint is it can be commonly found in Singapore now. Not the wool bird, not the crow, okay, but the pigeons. Okay, I can see many curious eyes now. Okay, so if you want to read more, please scan this QR code or access this URL to read further. Okay, we do have many of his works in our collection. So thankfully, Kawa has included some links here, and it leads to the full text of the articles that he has authored. Okay, so after this session, you may want to visit the book and specimen displays. They are currently stationed right outside the seminar room. How many of you have noticed that? Okay, just a handful, but it's okay because you have the time to visit these displays later on. So we have the book collection that originates from NUS libraries, as well as specimen that originates from the Concha Natural History Museum's collection. Okay, and this is the list of the featured book titles. So if you want to read these books, you can actually do a search in our NUS libraries portal, okay, to find out more about the access details. Okay, so that marks the end of my presentation, and I'll pass time back to Herman.
Okay, and I promise this is almost the end. Before we conclude the session, we have some token for our panelists. So Gladys will be passing some very unique bags for you guys. So NUS is celebrating NUS 120th this year. So we have actually special made tote bag to commemorate this occasion. Thanks so much. So on behalf of NUS Libraries again, we would like to thank our very honored guests for sharing the insight, the experiences, and of course the family heirloom that with us, and our partners and our visitors, the Bird Society, Department of History, and our dear partners, the Lee Chen Natural History Museum, to have made this very entertaining and fruitful session today. So we will end the event now. We'll have some refreshments that you can help yourselves to at the multipurpose room, so the left of the seminar room. And you're also welcome to look at the exhibitions that my colleague has mentioned earlier. Some specimens from the museum are there, very specially bought here. Okay, and some of the books are related to these things. Thank you very much, everybody. Yes, you.
Also, yeah, Gandhi. Also, thank you to Gandhi too. Yeah, Gandhi being and this
Behind us.